She stood at the edge of her own wedding celebration, feeling less like a bride and more like an expensive ornament no one had remembered to place on the mantelpiece. The candlelight from the chandeliers overhead caught the crystal glasses and silver trays, scattering rainbows across the ballroom of Thornwood Hall. Laughter rose in gentle waves around her, but none of it belonged to her. Her husband, Alexander Thornwood, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood across the room with his back half-turned toward her, deep in conversation with Lord Pemberton about some matter of Parliament. He had not looked at her in over an hour. Alara smoothed the ivory silk of her gown and forced her lips to hold a soft smile. The smile was a shield. It was the only weapon she had left. She had arrived at Thornwood Hall that morning as Lady Alara Vance, daughter of a baron whose estate was drowning in debt. By noon, she had become the Duchess of Ashbourne, a title that should have felt like a coronation but instead settled on her shoulders like a borrowed coat. Too heavy, too cold. The whispers had started before the ink dried on the register. A marriage of convenience, of course. Her father's creditors were at the door. The Duke practically purchased her. He will never love her. Everyone knows his heart belongs to someone else. Alara had heard every word. She had not flinched. She turned slightly and caught her reflection in the tall windows that overlooked the terrace. Dark hair pinned elegantly, pearls at her throat, cheeks flushed from the warmth of the room. She looked every inch a duchess. She felt every inch a fraud. Across the room, Alexander lifted his glass and said something that made Lord Pemberton chuckle. His profile was sharp and composed, all hard lines and restrained power. His dark hair was swept back, his jaw set with the kind of quiet authority that made men obey and women sigh. But his eyes, a pale shade of gray, held the temperature of winter. They had not warmed once when he looked at her. Not during the vows. Not when he slipped the ring onto her finger. Not when he had leaned down and brushed the most fleeting, formal kiss against her cheek, as the priest pronounced them man and wife. She had felt the cold of that kiss, long after his lips had left her skin. Now she stood alone while strangers raised toasts to a union that felt like a funeral for her heart. Somewhere in the crowd, her father was drinking too much champagne, relief slackening his face. He had sold her future to save his past. She could not blame him entirely. She had agreed to this arrangement, but she had agreed with hope. Hope that the Duke of Ashbourne, whom she had seen once at a garden party 2 summers ago, might have noticed something in her. Hope that behind the cold exterior lay a man capable of tenderness. Hope that this marriage might become something more than a transaction. The hope was already beginning to curdle into something else, something sharper. She watched as a woman in emerald silk glided toward Alexander and placed her hand familiarly on his sleeve. Lady Caroline Ashworth, widowed, beautiful, the daughter of an earl. She had been standing nearby all evening, her gaze following the Duke with proprietary confidence. Now she leaned close and murmured something that made his expression flicker, his mouth almost softening. Alara's stomach clenched. She looked away. The chandeliers continued to glitter. The music continued to play. And the new Duchess of Ashbourne stood motionless in the center of it all, feeling the first cold drop of loneliness seep through the armor she was desperately trying to build around her heart. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the house had fallen silent, Alara sat in the suite of rooms that had been prepared for her. It was beautiful. A sitting room in soft blues and creams, a bedroom with a canopied bed and fresh flowers on the nightstand. The fire crackled gently. Everything was perfect and impersonal. Alexander had escorted her to the door, bowed with stiff courtesy, and told her she would find everything she needed. Then he had walked away down the corridor without a backward glance. No tender words, no nervous warmth, just the echo of footsteps on marble. Alara had stood there still in her wedding gown and waited for something. A knock, a return, a sign that he might want to sit with her, talk to her, begin the slow work of building a life together. The knock never came. She had unpinned her hair herself, the pearls scattering across the dressing table. She had removed the gown alone, the silk pooling at her feet like shed skin. She had climbed into the vast, cold bed and stared at the canopy until dawn crept through the curtains. And in the gray morning light, she made a decision. If the Duke of Ashbourne did not want her heart, she would not force it upon him. She would be a duchess in duty. She would manage his household, support his endeavors, and never once let him see how desperately she craved the one thing he refused to give. But deep inside, locked away where even she rarely looked, the hope still flickered. It would take many months before it finally went dark. The first weeks at Thornwood Hall passed in a strange, suspended silence. Alara learned the rhythms of the great house. She met the servants, who were respectful but watchful, clearly waiting to see what sort of mistress she would become. She wrote letters to her father and received brief, distracted replies. She walked the gardens, which were sprawling and magnificent, wild roses climbing ancient stone walls, a lake reflecting the changing autumn sky. And she waited. She waited at the breakfast table each morning, hoping Alexander might join her. Sometimes he did, appearing with a newspaper in hand and a perfunctory greeting. He would eat quickly, answer her gentle questions with short, polite replies, and then excuse himself to attend to business. He never asked about her night. He never asked anything. At dinner, when they dined together, the silence was even heavier. The table stretched between them like a chasm. She would try to fill it with talk of the estate, of a book she had read, of a charity she wished to support in the village. He would listen, nod, and offer nothing in return. Once she gathered her courage and asked him directly, "Have I displeased you in some way, Your Grace?" He had looked up from his plate, eyes unreadable. "No." "Then why does it feel as though I am a ghost in your home?" He had set down his fork with a quiet clink. "You are not a ghost. You are the Duchess of Ashbourne. I have given you everything that title entails: comfort, security, respect." "But not your presence," she whispered. A muscle had tightened in his jaw. "I am not a man made for warmth, Alara. It is better you understand that now." He had risen and left the table. She had sat alone, the candles burning down, the food growing cold, feeling something inside her begin to harden. The months turned. Autumn bled into winter. Snow capped the turrets of Thornwood Hall and frost painted the windows. Alara threw herself into duties. She visited the tenants, bringing baskets of food and medicine. She organized repairs for cottages that had fallen into disrepair under the previous steward's neglect. She learned the names of farmers' wives and their children. She started a small school in the village for girls who had no access to education. She did not do it to impress Alexander. She did it because the work filled the hollow space inside her, and because it was who she truly was. But Alexander noticed. She knew because she occasionally felt his eyes on her across the drawing room in the evenings, a quiet, assessing gaze she could not decipher. He never spoke of her work, but one evening he appeared at dinner and mentioned, almost grudgingly, that Mrs. Harper, the cook, had told him the tenants were speaking well of her. "You are making a difference," he said, as if the words cost him something. Alara looked at him across the candles. "Is that such a surprise?" "No," his voice was low, "it is not a surprise at all." And for a fleeting moment, something in his gray eyes shifted, a crack in the ice. Then it was gone and he was reaching for his wine, the subject closed. Spring arrived, and with it came Lord Nathaniel Ashworth, Lady Caroline's brother. He was a captain in the Navy, home on leave, golden-haired and open-faced, with a laugh that filled rooms. Alexander invited him to stay at Thornwood Hall for a fortnight, a gesture that surprised Alara until she learned they had been friends since boyhood. Nathaniel was everything Alexander was not: warm, talkative, eager to listen. He would find Alara in the garden and walk beside her, asking about her projects with genuine interest. He would make her laugh with stories of the sea. He would bring her small tokens, a wildflower, a smooth stone, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Ilara did not mistake his attention for romance. Nathaniel was simply kind. But kindness, after so many months of cold courtesy, felt like sunlight after a long winter. And Alexander watched. He watched them walking together along the lake path, her head tilted toward Nathaniel's, her laughter carrying on the breeze. He watched at dinner as Nathaniel drew her into conversation, teasing her gently about her serious devotion to her school. He watched as she smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood Hall. One evening, after Nathaniel had retired, Alexander found Ilara in the library. She was curled in a chair by the fire, a book open on her lap, but her eyes were distant. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the dim corridor. "You enjoy his company." Ilara looked up, startled. "Captain Ashworth, he is very agreeable." "Agreeable?" Alexander repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. "He makes you laugh." "Is that a problem, Your Grace?" He stepped into the room, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. "You are my wife." The words hung in the air. Ilara closed her book slowly. "I am aware. I have been your wife for nearly a year, and in that year you have treated me with all the warmth of a business partner. Now you stand there and speak of possession as though I am a vase you have suddenly remembered you own." His eyes flared. "That is not fair." "No," she said quietly. "It is not fair. None of this has been fair." Silence stretched between them, thick and painful. Then Alexander turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Ilara sat in the firelight, her heart pounding, a strange, trembling anger rising in her chest. For so long she had been patient. She had been understanding. She had made excuses for him. But the sight of his jealousy, misplaced and possessive, ignited something she had been suppressing. She was not an object. She was not a contract. And she would no longer wait for a man who kept his heart locked away while demanding she hold hers out, empty-handed. That night she wrote a letter to her father, not to complain, not to ask for rescue, but to affirm something to herself. "I have decided to stop seeking what he cannot give. I will build a life of my own, and if he wishes to be part of it, he will have to learn to open his own door." She sealed the letter and set it on the tray. Then she climbed into her bed, and for the first time in months she did not cry. The change in Ilara was gradual but unmistakable. She stopped arranging her schedule around Alexander's. She stopped waiting for him at breakfast. She stopped dressing with the faint hope that he might notice a particular gown. Instead, she rose early, wore practical dresses suitable for visiting tenants, and filled her days with the work that had become her purpose. The school flourished. The village children adored her. The tenants spoke of her with growing affection. She felt, for the first time since her wedding, that she had a place in the world that was hers alone. Alexander, meanwhile, began to notice her absence in ways he had not anticipated. The breakfast table felt emptier without her quiet presence. The drawing room in the evening seemed cavernous when she did not appear. He would find himself listening for her footsteps, her soft voice speaking to the housekeeper, her laugh, so rare now, echoing down the corridor. One afternoon, he returned from a ride to find her in the courtyard with a group of village children, teaching them a song. Her hair had slipped free of its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was laughing, her hands moving to the rhythm, and the children were laughing with her. Nathaniel stood nearby, leaning against the fountain, watching with a smile. Alexander's hands tightened on the reins. He dismounted and handed his horse to a groom. He approached slowly, and the children fell silent, intimidated by the tall, stern Duke. Ilara looked up, her laughter fatting. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" "I need to speak with you." Nathaniel straightened. "Should I leave?" "No." Ilara's voice was calm but firm. "Whatever you need to say can be said here, surely." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It is a private matter." "Then it can wait until I have finished with the children." She turned back to them, her smile returning. "Shall we sing it once more?" The children, emboldened by her defiance, joined in. Alexander stood there for a long, charged moment, then turned and strode back toward the house. Nathaniel's gaze followed him, thoughtful. Then he looked at Alara. "He is troubled." Alara watched the dukes retreating back. "He is troubled by losing something he never valued until it was gone." That night, Alexander did not come to dinner. Alara ate alone, the silence no longer feeling like a punishment but a choice. She had chosen herself, and it felt, she realized, like freedom. But freedom, she would soon learn, had its own cost. The next week brought news that shook Thornwood Hall. Lady Caroline Ashworth arrived unannounced, her carriage pulling up the drive on a rainy afternoon. She claimed to be visiting her brother, but her eyes lingered too long on Alexander, her smiles too knowing. At dinner that first night, Caroline positioned herself beside the Duke, touching his arm, laughing at his rare remarks. She spoke of shared memories, of people Alara did not know, of a world that excluded her entirely. Alara sat at the opposite end of the table, feeling the old sting of humiliation rise in her throat, but she did not retreat. She watched, and what she saw was not a man captivated by a beautiful widow. She saw a man tolerating attention without reciprocating it. Alexander's responses were brief, his posture rigid. He did not lean toward Caroline. He did not smile. It was Nathaniel who finally broke the tension. "Caroline, you must tell us about your travels. I hear you caused quite a stir in Bath." Caroline laughed, a practiced, tinkling sound. "Bath was delightful, but I am far more interested in what has been happening here. You have become quite the country duchess, Lady Ashbourne, so dedicated to the common folk." The condescension in her voice was subtle but clear. Alara met her gaze. "Thank you, I find purpose in it." "Purpose?" Caroline's smile sharpened. "How admirable! Some of us must create purpose when other avenues are closed." The insinuation was unmistakable. Alara's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Caroline, that is enough." The table fell silent. Lady Caroline blinked, her confident mask slipping. "Alexander, I only meant." "I know what you meant." His gray eyes were cold as frost. "And I said it is enough. You are a guest in my wife's home, remember that." The words struck Alara like a physical force. His wife's home. He had never called it that before. He had never defended her before. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. She did not speak again for the rest of the meal. Later, as Alara was preparing for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Alexander standing in the corridor, still dressed, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered her sitting room, glancing around as if seeing it for the first time. He had never been in her private quarters before. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice low, "for Caroline's behavior. She has always been sharp-tongued, but tonight she crossed a line." "You did not have to defend me." "Yes, I did." He turned to face her. "You are my wife. I should have defended you long before tonight. I should have." He stopped, struggling with words that clearly did not come easily. "I have been a poor husband to you, Alara." She stood very still, her heart thudding. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because you have stopped looking at me." His voice was rough. "And I cannot bear it." The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Alara felt the sting of tears she refused to shed. "You made it clear from the beginning that you did not want my heart. I only gave you what you asked for." "I was wrong." He took a step closer. "I was a fool. I thought if I kept distance it would be easier for both of us, but I see now that I have only caused you pain." "Why?" she whispered. "Why could you not just let me in?" He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them there was something new in their depths. "Pain. Because I was afraid." The word cracked something open inside her. The Duke of Ashbourne afraid. It seemed impossible. Afraid of what? Of losing someone again. He drew a breath. There is something I have never told you, something I should have told you before we married. He moved to the fire, staring into the flames. When I was 23, I fell in love. At least I thought I did. Her name was Isabel. She was beautiful and clever, and I believed she loved me. We were engaged. Then 3 weeks before the wedding, she eloped with a wealthy merchant from Italy. She left a letter explaining that she had never loved me, that she had only wanted the title. She said I was too cold, too serious, too difficult to love. Ilara's breath caught. That was cruel. It was true. He turned to her, his gray eyes haunted. I am cold. I am serious. I have never known how to show my feelings. And after Isabel, I swore I would never let myself be vulnerable again. When your father approached me about this marriage, I agreed because I needed an heir. I told myself it was a transaction, but it was never just that. What do you mean? He took a step toward her. I remembered you. From the garden party at Lord Hastings' estate 2 summers ago. You were sitting under a willow tree, reading to a group of children. You had a streak of mud on your dress and you were laughing. I watched you for nearly half an hour. I did not know your name then, but I never forgot your face. Ilara's hand rose to her throat. You never told me. I did not know how. I convinced myself it did not matter, that I could keep my distance. But when Nathaniel arrived and I saw you smiling at him, laughing with him, I realized what I was losing, what I had already lost. Tears spilled down Ilara's cheeks. She did not try to stop them. You hurt me, Alexander, every day, for a year. I know, his voice broke. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn your forgiveness if you will let me. She looked at him. This man who had been a stranger and a husband and a source of such loneliness. She saw the cracks in his armor, the fear behind the ice, the longing he had buried so deep he had almost lost it forever. I am so tired of being alone, she whispered. He closed the distance between them and reached for her hands. His grip was warm, solid. Then do not be alone. Let me try. Let me learn. I cannot promise I will be perfect, but I can promise I will be here, every day, if you will let me stay. She searched his face, looking for the coldness, the distance. It was still there, faintly, like old scar tissue, but beneath it she saw something else, something fragile and fierce. Hope. She squeezed his hands. I have been waiting for you for so long. He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as though she might shatter. She pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry, releasing months of loneliness and longing. He held her through all of it, his hand stroking her hair, his lips pressing against her temple. I am sorry, he murmured. I am so sorry. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet crackle of the fire, the first true moment of connection they had ever shared. The weeks that followed were strange and tender. Alexander did not suddenly become a different man overnight. He was still reserved, still prone to long silences, still struggling with words. But he tried. He began taking breakfast with her every morning. He asked about her school, her plans, her dreams. He walked with her in the gardens, offering his arm, listening as she spoke. He sat beside her in the evenings, reading aloud from books of poetry because she had once told him she loved the sound of a voice in the quiet. And slowly, tentatively, Ilara allowed herself to hope again. One afternoon, she found a letter on her dressing table. It was written in Alexander's strong, deliberate hand. My dear Ilara, there are things I have not yet said aloud. Forgive me for putting them on paper when my voice still fails. From the moment I saw you under that willow tree, something in my frozen heart began to thaw. I fought it. I was terrified. I thought that if I let myself love you, you would one day see me as Isabel did, as a man not worth loving. I was wrong to make you pay for my old wounds. You deserved a husband who cherished you from the first day. Instead, I gave you silence and coldness, and still you bloomed in this house like a rose in winter. You gave your light to everyone, even when I gave you nothing. I love you. I have loved you for longer than I will ever be able to explain, and if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. Yours always, Alexander. Alara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it to her heart. She found him in the library, standing by the window, his back to her. He did not turn when she entered. Alexander. He turned then, and she saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had kept him distant for so long, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. She walked to him and took his face in her hands. I love you too. I think I have loved you from the first moment I saw you, standing so tall and alone at our wedding, and I wanted nothing more than to bring you comfort. He closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him. I do not deserve you. That is not for you to decide. She smiled, her thumb brushing his cheek. You are stuck with me now, Your Grace, so you had better get used to it. He laughed. It was a broken, beautiful sound, the first real laugh she had ever heard from him. Then he kissed her, softly and reverently, as though she were something precious. And in that kiss, all the cold months of distance and loneliness melted away, replaced by the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Summer came to Thornwood Hall, bringing warmth and new beginnings. The school flourished. The tenants prospered. Nathaniel returned to sea, but not before pulling Alexander aside one evening and telling him, with a grin, that if he ever made Alara cry again, he would personally sail back and challenge him to a duel. Caroline departed, her sharp smiles finally fading. She would move on to other conquests, other drawing rooms, but she would never again find purchase in their home. One evening, as the sun set over the lake and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Alexander and Alara walked along the path where she had once walked with Nathaniel. Now it was his hand holding hers, his voice filling the silence. I want to build a new wing for the school, he said, in your name, so that everyone will know what you have done here. She looked at him, surprised. You would do that? I would do anything for you. He stopped walking and turned to face her. You saved me, Alara, when I thought I was beyond saving. You waited for me even when I gave you every reason to leave. I will never stop trying to be worthy of that. She rose on her toes and kissed him, her heart so full it ached. You were always worthy. You just needed to believe it. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close, the last rays of sunlight warming their skin. In the years that followed, the story of the cold Duke and the patient Duchess became legend in the countryside. People spoke of how love had transformed Thornwood Hall from a fortress of silence into a home of warmth. They spoke of the Duchess's kindness and the Duke's devotion. They spoke of the school and the library and the garden where roses bloomed even in winter. But Alara and Alexander rarely spoke of the past. They did not need to. Every morning he woke beside her. Every evening he held her hand. Every small gesture of tenderness was its own confession. Love had come slowly, painfully, beautifully, and it had stayed. One night, long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, Alara sat by the fire in their shared sitting room, watching Alexander read. He looked up and caught her gaze, and the smile he gave her was no longer guarded or hesitant. It was the smile of a man at peace. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would wait 100 lonely years if it meant finding you at the end of them." He set aside his book and crossed the room to kneel beside her chair. "You will never be lonely again. That is my vow, not for a single day." She leaned her forehead against his. "I know." And in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the life they had built together, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne held each other and listened to the soft rhythm of a love that had finally, at long last, found its voice.